The Yosemite by John Muir. Chapter 1, Section E. An Unexpected Adventure. A wild scene, but not a safe one, is made by the moon as it appears through the edge of the Yosemite Fall when one is behind it. Once, after enjoying the night song of the waters and watching the formation of the colored bow as the moon came round the domes and sent her beams into the wild uproar, I ventured out on the narrow bench that extends back of the fall from Fern Ledge and began to admire the dim veiled grandeur of the view. I could see the fine gauzy threads of the fall's filmy border by having the light in front, and wishing to look at the moon through the meshes of some of the denser portions of the fall, I ventured to creep farther behind it while it was gently wind-swayed, without taking sufficient thought about the consequences of its swaying back to its natural position after the wind pressure should be removed. The effect was enchanting, fine savage music sounding above, beneath, around me, while the moon, apparently in the very midst of the rushing waters, seemed to be struggling to keep her place on account of the ever-varying form and density of the water masses through which she was seen, now darkly veiled or eclipsed by a rush of thick-headed comets, now flashing out through the openings between their tails. I was in fairyland between the dark wall and the wild throng of illumined waters, but suffered sudden disenchantment, for, like the witch scene in Alloway Kirk, in an instant all was dark. Down came a dash of spent comets, thin and harmless-looking in the distance, but they felt desperately solid and stony when they struck my shoulders, like a mixture of choking spray and gravel and big hailstones. Instinctively dropping on my knees, I gripped an angle of the rock, curled up like a young fern frond with my face pressed against my breast, and in this attitude submitted as best I could to my thundering bath. The heavier masses seemed to strike like cobblestones, and there was a confused noise of many waters about my ears, hissing, gurgling, clashing sounds that were not heard as music. The situation was quickly realized. How fast one's thoughts burn in such times of stress! I was weighing chances of escape. Would the column be swayed a few inches away from the wall, or would it come yet closer? The fall was in flood, and not so lightly would its ponderous mass be swayed. My fate seemed to depend on a breath of the idle wind. It was moved gently forward, the pounding ceased, and I was once more visited by glimpses of the moon. But fearing I might be caught at a disadvantage in making too hasty a retreat, I moved only a few feet along the bench to where a block of ice lay. I wedged myself between the ice and the wall and lay face downwards, until the steadiness of the light gave encouragement to rise and get away. Somewhat nerve-shaken, drenched, and benumbed, I made out to build a fire, warmed myself, ran home, reached my cabin before daylight, got an hour or two of sleep, and awoke sound and comfortable, better, not worse, for my hard midnight bath. Climate and Weather. Owing to the westerly trend of the valley and its vast depth, there is a great difference between the climates of the north and south sides, greater than between many countries far apart, for the south wall is in shadow during the winter months, while the north is bathed in sunshine every clear day. Thus there is mild spring weather on one side of the valley while winter rules the other. Far up the north side cliffs many a nook may be found closely embraced by sun-beaten rock bosses in which flowers bloom every month of the year. Even butterflies may be seen in these high winter gardens, except when snowstorms are falling and a few days after they have ceased. Near the head of the lower Yosemite Fall in January I found the antlions lying in wait in their warm sand cups, rock ferns being unrolled, club mosses covered with fresh-growing plants, the flowers of the laurel nearly open, and the honeysuckle rosetted with bright young leaves. Every plant seemed to be thinking about summer. Even on the shadow side of the valley the frost is never very sharp. The lowest temperature I ever observed during 4 winters was 7 degrees Fahrenheit. The first 24 days of January had an average temperature at 9 a.m. of 32 degrees, minimum 22 degrees. At 3 p.m. the average was 40 degrees, the minimum 32. Along the top of the walls, 7,000 and 8,000 feet high, the temperature was, of course, much lower. But the difference in temperature between the north and south sides is due not so much to the winter sunshine as to the heat of the preceding summer, stored up in the rocks, which rapidly melts the snow in contact with them. For though summer's sun heat is stored in the rocks of the south side also, the amount is much less because the rays fall obliquely on the south wall even in summer, and almost vertically on the north. The upper branches of the Yosemite streams are buried every winter beneath the heavy mantle of snow, and set free in the spring in magnificent floods. Then, all the fountains full and overflowing, every living thing breaks forth into singing, and the glad exulting streams, shining and falling in the warm sunny weather, shake everything into music, making all the mountain world a song. The great annual spring thaw usually begins in May in the forest region, and in June and July on the high Sierra, varying somewhat both in time and fullness with the weather and the depth of the snow. Toward the end of summer the streams are at their lowest ebb, few even of the strongest singing much above a whisper as they slip and ripple through gravel and boulder beds from pool to pool in the hollows of their channels, and drop in pattering showers like rain, and slip down precipices and fall in sheets of embroidery, fold over fold. But, however low their singing, it is always ineffably fine in tone, in harmony with the restful time of the year. The first snow of the season that comes to help of the streams usually falls in September or October, sometimes even in the latter part of August, in the midst of yellow Indian summer when the goldenrods and gentians of the glacier meadows are in their prime. This Indian summer snow, however, soon melts, the chilled flowers spread their petals to the sun, and the gardens as well as the streams are refreshed as if only a warm shower had fallen. The snowstorms that load the mountains to form the main fountain supply for the year seldom set in before the middle or end of November. Winter Beauty of the Valley. When the first heavy storms stopped work on the high mountains, I made haste down to my Yosemite den, not to hole up and sleep the white months away. I was out every day, and often all night, sleeping but little, studying the so-called wonders and common things ever on show, wading, climbing, sauntering among the blessed storms and calms, rejoicing in almost everything alike that I could see or hear, the glorious brightness of frosty mornings, the sunbeams pouring over the white domes and crags into the groves and waterfalls, kindling marvelous iris fires in the hoarfrost and spray, the great forests and mountains in their deep noon sleep, the good-night alpenglow, the stars, the solemn gazing moon, drawing the huge domes and headlands one by one glowing white out of the shadows, hushed and breathless like an audience in awful enthusiasm, while the meadows at their feet sparkle with frost stars like the sky, the sublime darkness of storm nights when all the lights are out, the clouds in whose depths the frail snow-flowers grow, the behavior and many voices of the different kinds of storms, trees, birds, waterfalls, and snow avalanches in the ever-changing weather. Every clear, frosty morning loud sounds are heard booming and reverberating from side to side of the valley at intervals of a few minutes, beginning soon after sunrise and continuing an hour or two like a thunderstorm. In my first winter in the valley I could not make out the source of this noise. I thought of falling boulders, rock blasting, etc. Not till I saw what looked like hoar-frost dropping from the side of the fall was the problem explained. The strange thunder is made by the fall of sections of ice formed of spray that is frozen on the face of the cliff along the sides of the upper Yosemite Fall, a sort of crystal plaster, a foot or two thick, racked off by the sunbeams, awakening all the valley like cock-crowing, announcing the finest weather, shouting aloud nature's infinite industry and love of hard work in creating beauty. Exploring an ice cone. This frozen spray gives rise to one of the most interesting winter features of the valley, a cone of ice at the foot of the fall, 400 or 500 feet high. From the Fern Ledge standpoint its crater-like throat is seen, down which the fall plunges with deep, gasping explosions of compressed air, and, after being well churned in the wormy interior, the water bursts forth through arched openings at its base, apparently scourged and weary, and glad to escape, while belching spray, spouted up out of the throat past the descending current, is wafted away in irised drifts to the adjacent rocks and groves. It is built during the night and early hours of the morning. Only in spells of exceptionally cold and cloudy weather is the work continued through the day. The greater part of the spray material falls in crystalline showers direct to its place, something like a small local snowstorm, but a considerable portion is first frozen on the face of the cliff along the sides of the fall and stays there until expanded and cracked off in irregular masses, some of them tons in weight, to be built into the walls of the cone, while in windy, frosty weather, when the fall is swayed from side to side, The cone is well drenched, and the loose ice masses and spray dust are all firmly welded and frozen together. Thus the finest of the downy wafts and curls of spray dust, which in mild nights fall about as silently as dew, are held back until sunrise to make a store of heavy ice to reinforce the waterfall's thunder tones. While the cone is in process of formation, growing higher and wider in the frosty weather, it looks like a beautiful, smooth, pure white hill, but when it is wasting and breaking up in the spring, its surface is strewn with leaves, pine branches, stones, sand, etc., that have been brought over the fall, making it look like a heap of avalanche detritus. Anxious to learn what I could about the structure of this curious hill, I often approached it in calm weather and tried to climb it, carrying an axe to cut steps. Once I nearly succeeded in gaining the summit. At the base I was met by a current of spray and wind that made seeing and breathing difficult. I pushed on backward, however, and soon gained the slope of the hill, where by creeping close to the surface most of the choking blast passed over me, and I managed to crawl up with but little difficulty. Thus I made my way nearly to the summit, halting at times to peer up through the wild whirls of spray at the veiled grandeur of the fall, or to listen to the thunder beneath me. The whole hill was sounding as if it were a huge bellowing drum. I hoped that by waiting until the fall was blown aslant, I should be able to climb to the lip of the crater, and get a view of the interior, but a suffocating blast, half air, half water, followed by the fall of an enormous mass of frozen spray from a spot high up on the wall, quickly discouraged me. The whole cone was jarred by the blow, and some fragments of the mass sped past me dangerously near, so I beat a hasty retreat, chilled and drenched, and lay down on a sunny rock to dry. Once during a windstorm, when I saw that the fall was frequently blown westward, leaving the cone dry, I ran up to Fern Ledge, hoping to gain a clear view of the interior. I set out at noon. All the way up, the storm notes were so loud about me that the voice of the fall was almost drowned by them. Notwithstanding the rocks and bushes everywhere were drenched by the wind-driven spray, I approached the brink of the precipice, overlooking the mouth of the ice cone, but I was almost suffocated by the drenching, gusty spray, and was compelled to seek shelter. I searched for some hiding place in the wall from whence I might run out at some opportune moment, when the fall with its whirling spray and torn shreds of comet tails and trailing, tattered skirts was borne westward, as I had seen it carried several times before, leaving the cliffs on the east side and the ice hill bare in the sunlight. I had not long to wait, for, as if ordered so for my special accommodation, the mighty downrush of comets, with their whirling drapery, swung westward and remained aslant for nearly half an hour. The cone was admirably lighted and deserted by the water, which fell most of the time on the rocky western slopes mostly outside of the cone. The mouth into which the fall pours was, as near as I could guess, about 100 feet in diameter north and south, and about 200 feet east and west, which is about the shape and size of the fall at its best in its normal condition at this season. The crater-like opening was not a true oval, but more like a huge coarse mouth. I could see down the throat about 100 feet, or perhaps farther. The fall precipice overhangs from a height of 400 feet above the base. Therefore the water strikes some distance from the base of the cliff, allowing space for the accumulation of a considerable mass of ice between the fall and the wall. End of Section E, and end of Chapter 1.
The Yosemite by John Muir. Chapter 2. Winter Storms and Spring Floods. The Bridal Veil and the Upper Yosemite Falls, on account of their height and exposure, are greatly influenced by winds. The common summer winds that come up the river canyon from the plains are seldom very strong, but the north winds do some very wild work, worrying the falls and the forests, and hanging snow banners on the comet peaks. One wild winter morning I was awakened by storm wind that was playing with the falls as if they were mere wisps of mist, and making the great pines bow and sing with glorious enthusiasm. The valley had been visited a short time before by a series of fine snowstorms, and the floor and the cliffs and all the region round about were lavishly adorned with its best winter jewelry. The air was full of fine snow dust, and pine branches, tassels, and empty cones were flying in an almost continuous flock. Soon after sunrise, when I was seeking a place safe from flying branches, I saw the lower Yosemite Fall thrashed and pulverized from top to bottom into one glorious mass of rainbow dust, while 1,000 feet above it the main upper fall was suspended on the face of the cliff in the form of an inverted bow, all silvery white and fringed with short wavering strips. Then, suddenly assailed by a tremendous blast, the whole mass of the fall was blown into thread and ribbons, and driven back over the brow of the cliff whence it came, as if denied admission to the valley. This kind of storm work was continued about 10 or 15 minutes. Then another change in the play of the huge, exulting swirls and billows and upheaving domes of the gale allowed the baffled fall to gather and arrange its tattered waters and sink down again in its place. As the day advanced, the gale gave no sign of dying. Excepting brief lulls, the valley was filled with its weariless roar, and the cloudless sky grew garish white from myriads of minute, sparkling snow spicules. In the afternoon, while I watched the upper fall from the shelter of a big pine tree, it was suddenly arrested in its descent at a point about halfway down, and was neither blown upward nor driven aside, but simply held stationary in mid-air, as if gravitation below that point in the path of its descent had ceased to act. The ponderous flood, weighing hundreds of tons, was sustained, hovering, hesitating, like a bunch of thistledown, while I counted 190. All this time the ordinary amount of water was coming over the cliff and accumulating in the air, swedging and widening and forming an irregular cone about 700 feet high, tapering to the top of the wall, the whole standing still, jesting on the invisible arm of the north wind. At length, as if commanded to go on again, scores of arrowy comets shot forth from the bottom of the suspended mass, as if escaping from separate outlets. The brow of El Capitan was decked with long snow streamers like hair. Cloud's Rest was fairly enveloped in drifting gossamer elms, and the half-dome loomed up in the garish light like a majestic living creature clad in the same gauzy wind-woven drapery, while upward currents meeting at times overhead made it smoke like a volcano. An extraordinary storm and flood. Glorious as are these rocks and waters arrayed in storm robes, or chanting rejoicing in everyday dress, they are still more glorious when rare weather conditions meet to make them sing with floods. Only once during all the years I have lived in the valley have I seen it in full flood bloom. In 1871, the early winter weather was delightful. The days all sunshine, the nights all starry and calm, calling forth fine crops of frost crystals on the pines and withered ferns and grasses for the morning sunbeams to sift through. In the afternoon of December the 16th, when I was sauntering on the meadows, I noticed a massive crimson cloud growing in solitary grandeur above the cathedral rocks, its form scarcely less striking than its color. It had a picturesque bulging base like an old sequoia, a smooth tapering stem, and a bossy down-curling crown like a mushroom. All its parts were colored alike, making one mass of translucent crimson. Wondering what the meaning of that strange lonely red cloud might be, I was up betimes next morning looking at the weather, but all seemed tranquil as yet. Towards noon, grey clouds with a loose, curly grain like bird's-eye maple began to grow, and late at night rain fell, which soon changed to snow. Next morning, the snow on the meadows was about 10 inches deep, and it was still falling in a fine, cordial storm. During the night of the 18th, heavy rain fell on the snow, but as the temperature was 34 degrees, the snow line was only a few hundred feet above the bottom of the valley, and one had only to climb a little higher than the tops of the pines to get out of the rainstorm into the snowstorm. The streams, instead of being increased in volume by the storm, were diminished, because the snow sponged up part of their waters and choked the smaller tributaries. But about midnight the temperature suddenly rose to 42 degrees, carrying the snow line far beyond the valley walls, and next morning Yosemite was rejoicing in a glorious flood. The comparatively warm rain falling on the snow was at first absorbed and held back, and so also was that portion of the snow that the rain melted, and all that was melted by the warm wind, until the whole mass of snow was saturated and became sludgy, and at length slipped and rushed simultaneously from 1,000 slopes in wildest extravagance, heaping and swelling flood over flood, and plunging into the valley in stupendous avalanches. Awakened by the roar, I looked out and at once recognized the extraordinary character of the storm. The rain was still pouring in torrent abundance, and the wind at gale speed was doing all it could with the flood-making rain. The section of the north wall visible from my cabin was fairly streaked with new falls, wild, roaring singers that seemed strangely out of place. Eager to get into the midst of the show, I snatched a piece of bread for breakfast and ran out. The mountain waters, suddenly liberated, seemed to be holding a grand jubilee. The two sentinel cascades rivaled the great falls at ordinary stages, and across the valley by the Three Brothers I caught glimpses of more falls than I could readily count, while the whole valley throbbed and trembled and was filled with an awful, massive, solemn, sea-like roar. After gazing a while, enchanted with the network of new falls that were adorning and transfiguring every rock in sight, I tried to reach the upper meadows where the valley is widest, that I might be able to see the walls on both sides, and thus gain general views. But the river was over its banks, and the meadows were flooded, forming an almost continuous lake, dotted with blue, sludgy islands, while innumerable streams roared like lions across my path, and were sweeping forward rocks and logs with tremendous energy over ground where tiny gilias had been growing but a short time before. Climbing into the talus slopes, where these savage torrents were broken among earthquake boulders, I managed to cross them and force my way up the valley to Hutchings Bridge, where I crossed the river and waded to the middle of the upper meadow. Here most of the new falls were in sight, probably the most glorious assemblage of waterfalls ever displayed from any one standpoint. On that portion of the south wall between Hutchings and the Sentinel, there were 10 falls, plunging and booming from a height of nearly 3,000 feet, the smallest of which might have been heard miles away. In the neighborhood of Glacier Point, there were 6, between the Three Brothers and Yosemite Fall, 9, between Yosemite and Royal Arch Falls, 10, from Washington Column to Mount Watkins, 10, on the slopes of Half Dome and Cloud's Rest, facing Mirror Lake and Tenaya Canyon, 8, on the shoulder of Half Dome, facing the valley, 3. 56 new falls occupying the upper end of the valley, besides a countless host of silvery threads gleaming everywhere. In all the valley there must have been upwards of 100. As if celebrating some great event, falls and cascades in Yosemite costume were coming down everywhere from fountain basins far and near, and, though newcomers, they behaved and sang as if they had lived here always. All summer visitors will remember the comet forms of the Yosemite Fall, and the lacers of the Bridal Veil and Nevada. In the falls of this winter jubilee, the lace forms predominated, but there was no lack of thunder-toned comets. The lower portion of one of the Sentinel Cascades was composed of two main white torrents, with the space between them filled in with chained and beaded gores of intricate pattern, through the singing threads of which the purplish-grey rock could be dimly seen. The series above Glacier Point was still more complicated in structure, displaying every form that one could imagine water might be dashed and combed and woven into. Those on the north wall between Washington Column and the Royal Arch Fall were so nearly related they formed an almost continuous sheet, and these again were but slightly separated from those about Indian Canyon. The group about the Three Brothers and El Capitan, owing to the topography and cleavage of the cliffs back of them, was more broken and irregular. The Tissiack Cascades were comparatively small, yet sufficient to give that noblest of mountain rocks a glorious voice. In the midst of all this extravagant rejoicing, the great Yosemite Fall was scarce heard until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Then I was startled by a sudden thundering crash, as if a rock avalanche had come to the help of the roaring waters. This was the flood wave of Yosemite Creek, which had just arrived, delayed by the distance it had to travel, and by the choking snows of its widespread fountains. Now, with volume tenfold increased beyond its springtime fullness, it took its place as leader of the glorious choir. And the winds, too, were singing in wild accord, playing on every tree and rock, surging against the huge brows and domes and outstanding battlements, deflected hither and thither, and broken into 1,000 cascading, roaring currents in the canyons, and low, bass, drumming swirls in the hollows. And these, again, reacting on the clouds, eroded immense cavernous spaces in their gray depths, and swept forward the resulting detritus in ragged trains like the moraines of glaciers. These cloud movements, in turn, published the work of the winds, giving them a visible body and enabling us to trace them. As if endowed with independent motion, a detached cloud would rise hastily to the very top of the wall, as if on some important errand, examining the faces of the cliffs, and then perhaps as suddenly descend, to sweep imposingly along the meadows, trailing its draggled fringes through the pines, fondling the waving spires with infinite gentleness, or gliding behind a grove or a single tree, bringing it into striking relief as it bowed and waved in solemn rhythm. Sometimes, as the busy clouds drooped and condensed or dissolved to misty gauze, half of the valley would be suddenly veiled, leaving here and there some lofty headland cut off from all visible connection with the walls, looming alone, dim, spectral, as if belonging to the sky. Visitors, like the new falls, come to take part in the glorious festival. Thus for 2 days and nights in measureless extravagance the storm went on, and mostly without spectators, at least of a terrestrial kind. I saw nobody out, bird, bear, squirrel, or man. Tourists had vanished months before, and the hotel people and laborers were out of sight, careful about getting cold, and satisfied with views from windows. The bears, I suppose, were in their canyon boulder dens, the squirrels in their knot-hole nests, the grouse in close fir groves, and the small singers in the Indian Canyon chaparral, trying to keep warm and dry. Strange to say, I did not see even the water ouzels, though they must have greatly enjoyed the storm. This was the most sublime waterfall flood I ever saw. Clouds winds, rocks, waters, throbbing together as one. And then to contemplate what was going on simultaneously with all this in other mountain temples. The Big Tuolumne Canyon, how the white waters and the winds were singing there. And in Hetch Hetchy Valley and the Great Kings River Yosemite, and in all the other Sierra canyons and valleys from Shasta to the southernmost fountains of the Kern. Thousands of rejoicing flood waterfalls chanting together in jubilee dress. End of Chapter 2. The Yosemite by John Muir. Chapter 3. Snowstorms. As has been already stated, the first of the great snowstorms that replenish the Yosemite fountains seldom sets in before the end of November. Then, warned by the sky, wide-awake mountaineers, together with the deer and most of the birds, make haste to the lowlands or foothills, and burrowing marmots, mountain beavers, wood rats, and other small mountain people go into winter quarters, some of them not again to see the light of day until the general awakening and resurrection of the spring in June or July. The fertile clouds, drooping and condensing in brooding silence, seem to be thoughtfully examining the forests and streams with reference to the work that lies before them. At length, all their plans perfected, tufted flakes and single starry crystals come in sight, solemnly swirling and glinting to their blessed appointed places, and soon the busy throng fills the sky and makes darkness like night. The first heavy fall is usually from about 2 to 4 feet in depth. Then, with intervals of days or weeks of bright weather, storm succeeds storm, heaping snow on snow, until 30 to 50 feet has fallen. But on account of its settling and compacting, and waste from melting and evaporation, the average depth actually found at any time seldom exceeds 10 feet in the forest regions, or 15 feet along the slopes of the summit peaks. After snowstorms come avalanches, varying greatly in form, size, behavior, and in the songs they sing. Some on the smooth slopes of the mountains are short and broad, others long and river-like in the side canyons of Yosemites and in the main canyons, flowing in regular channels and booming like waterfalls, while countless smaller ones fall everywhere from laden trees and rocks and lofty canyon walls. Most delightful it is to stand in the middle of Yosemite on still, clear mornings after snowstorms and watch the throng of avalanches as they come down rejoicing to their places, whispering, thrilling like birds, or booming and roaring like thunder. The noble yellow pines stand hushed and motionless as if under a spell, until the morning sunshine begins to sift through their laden spires. Then the dense masses on the ends of the leafy branches begin to shift and fall, those from the upper branches striking the lower ones in succession, enveloping each tree in a hollow conical avalanche of fairy fineness, while the relieved branches spring up and wave with startling effect in the general stillness, as if each tree was moving of its own volition. Hundreds of broad cloud-shaped masses may also be seen, leaping over the brows of the cliffs from great heights, descending at first with regular avalanche speed until, worn into dust by friction, they float in front of the precipices, like irised clouds. Those which descend from the brow of El Capitan are particularly fine, but most of the great Yosemite avalanches flow in regular channels like cascades and waterfalls. When the snow first gives way on the upper slopes of their basins, a dull rushing rumbling sound is heard, which rapidly increases and seems to draw nearer with appalling intensity of tone. Presently the white flood comes bounding into sight over bosses and sheer places, leaping from bench to bench, spreading and narrowing and throwing off clouds of whirling dust like the spray of foaming cataracts. Compared with waterfalls and cascades, avalanches are short-lived, few of them lasting more than a minute or two, and the sharp clashing sounds so common in falling water are mostly wanting. But in their low, massy thundertones and purple-tinged whiteness, and in their dress, gait, gestures, and general behavior, they are much alike. Avalanches. Besides these common after-storm avalanches that are to be found not only in the Yosemite, but in all the deep sheer-walled canyon of the range, there are two other important kinds, which may be called annual and century avalanches, which still further enrich the scenery. The only place about the valley where one may be sure to see the annual kind is on the north slope of Cloud's Rest. They are composed of heavy compacted snow, which has been subjected to frequent alternations of freezing and thawing. They are developed on canyon and mountain sides at an elevation of from 9 to 10,000 feet, where the slopes are inclined at an angle too low to shed off the dry winter snow, and which accumulates until the spring thaws sap their foundations and make them slippery. Then away in grand style go the ponderous icy masses, without any fine snow dust. Those of Cloud's Rest descend like thunderbolts for more than a mile. The great century avalanches, and the kind that mow wide swaths through the upper forests, occur on mountainsides about 10 or 12,000 feet high, where under ordinary weather conditions the snow accumulated from winter to winter lies at rest for many years, allowing trees, 50 to 100 feet high, to grow undisturbed on the slopes beneath them. On their way down through the woods, they seldom fail to make a perfectly clean sweep, stripping off the soil as well as the trees, clearing paths 200 or 300 yards wide from the timberline to the glacier meadows or lakes, and piling their uprooted trees head downward in rows along the sides of the gaps like lateral moraines. Scars and broken branches of the trees standing on the sides of the gaps record the depth of the overwhelming flood, and when we come to count the annual wood rings on the uprooted trees, we learn that some of these immense avalanches occur only once in a century, or even at still wider intervals. A ride on an avalanche. Few Yosemite visitors ever see snow avalanches, and fewer still know the exhilaration of riding on them. In all my mountaineering I have enjoyed only one avalanche ride, and the start was so sudden and the end came so soon I had but little time to think of the danger that attends this sort of travel, though at such times one thinks fast. One fine Yosemite morning after a heavy snowfall, being eager to see as many avalanches as possible, and wide views of the forest and summit peaks in their new white robes before the sunshine had time to change them, I set out early to climb by a side canyon to the top of a commanding ridge a little over 3,000 feet above the valley. On account of the looseness of the snow that blocked the canyon, I knew the climb would require a long time, some 3 or 4 hours as I estimated, but it proved far more difficult than I had anticipated. Most of the way I sank waist deep, almost out of sight in some places. After spending the whole day to within half an hour or so of sundown, I was still several hundred feet below the summit. Then my hopes were reduced to getting up in time to see the sunset. But I was not to get summit views of any sort that day. For deep trampling near the canyon head, where the snow was strained, started an avalanche, and I was swished down to the foot of the canyon as if by enchantment. The wallowing ascent had taken nearly all day, the descent only about a minute. When the avalanche started, I threw myself on my back and spread my arms to try to keep from sinking. Fortunately, though the grade of the canyon is very steep, it is not interrupted by precipices large enough to cause outbounding or free plunging. On no part of the rush was I buried. I was only moderately embedded on the surface, or at times a little below it, and covered with a veil of back-streaming dust particles. And as the whole mass beneath and about me joined in the flight, there was no friction, though I was tossed here and there and lurched from side to side. When the avalanche swedged and came to rest, I found myself on top of the crumpled pile, without bruise or scar. This was a fine experience. Hawthorne says somewhere that steam has spiritualized travel, though unspiritual smells, smoke, etc., still attend steam travel. This flight in what might be called a Milky Way of snow stars was the most spiritual and exhilarating of all the modes of motion I have ever experienced. Elijah's flight in a chariot of fire could hardly have been more gloriously exciting. The streams in other seasons. In the spring, after all the avalanches are down and the snow is melting fast, then all the Yosemite streams, from their fountains to their falls, sing their grandest songs. Countless rills make haste to the rivers, running and singing soon after sunrise, louder and louder with increasing volume until sundown. Then they gradually fail through the frosty hours of the night. In this way the volume of the upper branches of the river is nearly doubled during the day, rising and falling as regularly as the tides of the sea. Then the Merced overflows its banks, flooding the meadows, sometimes almost from wall to wall in some places, beginning to rise towards sundown, just when the streams on the fountains are beginning to diminish, the difference in time of the daily rise and fall being caused by the distance the upper flood streams have to travel before reaching the valley. In the warmest weather they seem fairly to shout for joy and clash their upleaping waters together like clapping of hands, racing down the canyons with white manes flying in glorious exuberance of strength, compelling huge sleeping boulders to wake up and join in their dance and song, to swell their exulting chorus. In early summer, after the flood season, the Yosemite streams are in their prime, running crystal clear, deep, and full, but not overflowing their banks, about as deep through the night as the day, the difference in volume so marked in spring being now too slight to be noticed. Nearly all the weather is cloudless and everything is at its brightest. Lake, river, garden, and forest, with all their life. Most of the plants are in full flower. The blessed ouzels have built their mossy huts, and are now singing their best songs with the streams. In tranquil, mellow autumn, when the year's work is about done and the fruits are ripe, birds and seeds out of their nests, and all the landscape is glowing like a benevolent countenance, then the streams are at their lowest ebb, with scarce a memory left of their wild spring floods. The small tributaries that do not reach back to the lasting snow fountains of the summit peaks shrink to whispering, tinkling currents. After the snow is gone from the basins, excepting occasional thunder showers, they are now fed only by small springs, whose waters are mostly evaporated in passing over miles of warm pavements, and in feeling their way slowly from pool to pool through the midst of boulders and sand. Even the main rivers are so low they may easily be forded, and their grand falls and cascades, now gentle and approachable, have waned to sheets of embroidery. End of Chapter 3.
The Yosemite by John Muir. Chapter 4, Part A. Snow Banners. But it is on the mountain tops, when they are laden with loose, dry snow, and swept by a gale from the north, that the most magnificent storm scenery is displayed. The peaks along the axis of the range are then decorated with resplendent banners, some of them more than a mile long, shining, streaming, waving with solemn, exuberant enthusiasm, as if celebrating some surpassingly glorious event. The snow of which these banners are made falls on the high Sierra in most extravagant abundance, sometimes to a depth of 15 or 20 feet, coming from the fertile clouds not in large angled flakes, such as one oftentimes sees in Yosemite, seldom even in complete crystals, for many of the starry blossoms fall before they are ripe, while most of those that attain perfect development as six-petaled flowers are more or less broken by glinting and chafing against one another on the way down to their work. This dry, frosty snow is prepared for the grand, banner-waving celebrations by the action of the wind. Instead of at once finding rest, like that which falls into the tranquil depths of the forest, it is shoved and rolled and beaten against boulders and outjutting rocks, swirled in pits and hollows like sand in river potholes, and ground into sparkling dust. And when storm winds find this snow dust in a loose condition on the slopes above the timberline, they toss it back into the sky and sweep it onward from peak to peak in the form of smooth, regular banners, or in cloudy drifts, according to the velocity and direction of the wind, and the conformation of the slopes over which it is driven. While thus flying through the air, a small portion escapes from the mountains to the sky as vapor, but for the greater part is at length locked fast in bossy, over-curling cornices along the ridges, or in stratified sheets in the glacier cirques, some of it to replenish the small residual glaciers and remain silent and rigid for centuries before it is finally melted and sent singing down home to the sea. But though snow dust and storm winds abound on the mountains, regular shapely banners are, for causes we shall presently see, seldom produced. During the 5 winters that I spent in Yosemite, I made many excursions to high points above the walls in all kinds of weather, to see what was going on outside. From all my lofty outlooks, I saw only one banner storm that seemed in every way perfect. This was in the winter of 1873, when the snow-laden peaks were swept by a powerful norther. I was awakened early in the morning by a wild storm wind, and, of course, I had to make haste to the middle of the valley to enjoy it. Rugged torrents and avalanches from the main wind flood overhead were roaring down the side canyons and over the cliffs, arousing the rocks and the trees and the streams alike into glorious, hurrahing enthusiasm, shaking the whole valley into one huge song. Yet, inconceivable as it must seem, even to those who love all nature's wildness, the storm was telling its story on the mountains in still grander characters. A wonderful winter scene. I had long been anxious to study some points in the structure of the ice hill at the foot of the upper Yosemite Fall, but, as I have already explained, blinding spray had hitherto prevented me from getting sufficiently near it. This morning, the entire body of the fall was oftentimes torn into gauzy strips and blown horizontally along the face of the cliff, leaving the ice hill dry. And, while making my way to the top of Fern Ledge, to seize so favorable an opportunity to look down its throat, the peaks of the Merced group came in sight over the shoulder of the South Dome, each waving a white glowing banner against the dark blue sky, as regular in form and firm and fine in texture as if it were made of silk. So rare and splendid a picture, of course, smothered everything else, and I at once began to scramble and wallow up the snow-choked Indian Cañon to a ridge about 8,000 feet high, commanding a general view of the main summits along the axis of the range, feeling assured I should find them bannered still more gloriously. Nor was I in the least disappointed. I reached the top of the ridge in 4 or 5 hours, and through an opening in the woods the most imposing windstorm effect I ever beheld came full in sight. Unnumbered mountains rising sharply into the cloudless sky, their bases solid white, their sides plashed with snow like ocean rocks with foam, and on every summit a magnificent silvery banner, from 2,000 to 6,000 feet in length, slender at the point of attachment and widening gradually until about 1,000 or 1,500 feet in breadth, and as shapely and as substantial looking in texture as the banners of the finest silk, all streaming and waving free and clear in the sun-glow, with nothing to blur the sublime picture they made. Fancy yourself standing beside me on this Yosemite ridge. There is a strange, garish glitter in the air, and the gale drives wildly overhead, but you feel nothing of its violence, for you are looking out through a sheltered opening in the woods, as through a window. In the immediate foreground there is a forest of silver fir, their foliage warm yellow-green, and the snow beneath them strewn with their plumes, plucked off by the storm. And beyond broad, ridgy, cañon-furrowed, dome-dotted middle ground, darkened here and there with belts of pines, you behold the lofty, snow-laden mountains in glorious array, waving their banners with jubilant enthusiasm as if shouting aloud for joy. They are 20 miles away, but you would not wish them nearer, for every feature is distinct, and the whole wonderful show is seen in its right proportions, like a painting on the sky. And now, after this general view, mark how sharply the ribs and buttresses and summits of the mountains are defined, excepting the portions veiled by the banners. How gracefully and nobly the banners are waving in accord with the throbbing of the wind flood. How trimly each is attached to the very summit of its peak, like a streamer at a masthead. How bright and glowing white they are, and how finely their fading fringes are penciled on the sky. See how solid white and opaque they are at the point of attachment, and how filmy and translucent toward the end, so that the parts of the peaks past which they are streaming look dim as if seen through a veil of ground glass. And see how some of the longest of the banners, on the highest peaks, are streaming perfectly free, from peak to peak, across intervening notches or passes, while others overlap and partly hide one another. As to their formation, we find that the main causes of the wondrous beauty and perfection of those we are looking at are the favorable direction and force of the wind, the abundance of snow dust, and the form of the north sides of the peaks. In general, the north sides are concave in both their horizontal and vertical sections, having been sculptured into this shape by the residual glaciers that lingered in the protecting northern shadows, while the sun-beaten south sides, having never been subjected to this kind of glaciation, are convex or irregular. It is essential, therefore, not only that the wind should move with great velocity and steadiness to supply a sufficiently copious and continuous stream of snow dust, but that it should come from the north. No perfect banner is ever hung on the Sierra peaks by the south wind. Had the gale today blown from the south, leaving the other conditions unchanged, only swirling, interfering, cloudy drifts would have been produced, for the snow, instead of being spouted straight up and over the tops of the peaks in condensed currents to be drawn out as streamers, would have been driven over the convex southern slopes from peak to peak like white, pearly fog. It appears, therefore, that shadows, in great part, determine not only the forms of lofty ice mountains, but also those of the snow banners that the wild winds hang upon them. End of Chapter 4, Part A.